In this video, we're going to create a simple support form and embed it within the application to demonstrate how to do a basic form embedding. I'll also show you how to pass data to the form and how to listen to form events. If you haven't already done so, I highly recommend you watch parts 1 and 2 of this series. They show how to use the portal and set up your starter application. I'm going to assume you already have the Angular Starter Kit application up and running. The quick recap is get the ng app starter kit from GitHub, run npm install and bower install, and then use gulp serve to run the app. As you can see, we've already installed all our dependencies and have the app up and running. Let's start off by going to the Form.IO portal and creating a new form. We're going to call this the support form because it's going to handle support requests. We're going to add a text field called name, or your name, and that's going to contain the name of the person submitting the support request. We're also going to add in an email address. Later we can add an email action if we like to send an email to this email address. We're also going to include a type of the support request. So in here we're going to use just the basic values data. We're going to add in the a few examples we could have, like feedback, like support, like if they're requesting support, whether they want sales, or some other type of activity. Finally, we want to add in a text area, which is going to be the message of the support request. That's very important. It's kind of hard to do this without a message. We'll save it, and then we can preview it and see what's coming up. And it looks like our form is designed pretty well. This is the page for embedding it. We're going to come back to that shortly. Now we're back within our application. Our application is built using Angular UI Router, and we use the index.route.js file to configure it. You'll notice inside of the index.route.js file, we already have one state defined, and that is the home state. That's you can use other routers and other file structures if you'd like. This is just the one that we have set up to run our application. So this home state is already set up, and we can see that this is the contents of the home page already running. It contains a form and just some simple documentation. And what we want to do is add another state to this application. We're going to call it support. So we add the support name. We say that the URL is /support, and that's what's going to end up in the browser later. We're going to add a template. Now you can either add a template URL or a template. We're going to start with the simple case and add a template. And in this template, we're going to put the markup for the support page. And this is just going to be using basic Bootstrap classes. In here, we're going to create a panel and use the Bootstrap panel classes. Here we're adding a header for the panel. We're just going to give it the text of get support. This is just a header of the panel. Then we add in the panel body. And the panel body will actually contain the form. Now we're going to use the Form.IO directive in here for this. And for that, we're going to use the source of the Form.IO directive. And in order to add that, we're going to go back to our Form.IO portal, find the embed page, and copy the URL of the form we created and paste that in there. Later on, we'll move this URL to the config file, but for now, we'll just leave it there. Next, we need to finish out this template by closing out the high-level div. And then we now have created our support page. However, there's one other thing we need to do, which is add a link to the support page. If we go to our index.html file, you'll notice we have a navbar class with already a home link. We're going to duplicate that, change it out to support, and add in the support name, which is the name of the UI state. And that, when you click on it, then it will switch to it. So let's reload our app. And sure enough, there's a support link. We click on it, and we don't get a form. And the reason for that is that we forgot one thing. The URL in Angular, it's assuming this is a variable. So we actually want to pass in a string. So we're going to add in the single quotes around it. So it's saying it's a string being passed in. And now we get our form very nicely in there. So that's great. We can now try filling it out. We're going to add John Smith. We're going to add a dummy email address, john@example.com. We're going to say it's feedback and just say, this looks great. Awesome. Submit. Uh-oh. we got an unauthorized. Let's see if we can figure out what's going on here. Well, the answer really is that inside of our application, we have a lot of roles and permissions and stuff going on that's not allowing access to submit this form. So we're going to have to add in that permission. And if you go to the Access tab, there's a bunch of permissions in here. I'll go into these in more detail, but for now, the create own and create all are what we need. The create own allows a user to create submissions for their own user account. Create all allows them to go to other ones. For now, let's add anonymous, save this page, and see how well it works. Again, I'll go into that in more detail in a later video. So now let's try and submit it again. And now we get submission was created. That means it's submitted successfully. That's excellent. However, we don't really want this experience for the end user, just having it submit, stay on the page and say submission was created. What we'd rather do is have a thank you page for the end users. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go back to the route.js file and add in another state, the thanks state. So this is the same process as adding the support page. However, we're going to do it a little bit differently. Instead of defining the template directly in here, we're actually going to create some files to do that. So here we create the state, and we're going to add a template URL to the app/thanks/thanks.html file. Next, we need to actually create these files. So let's go add a new directory called thanks and another file within it called thanks.html. And we're going to just paste in some markup of a simple thank you page that says, thank you for contacting support. We'll be back to you soon. Great. Now, let's see what happens. See, we've done it as a template URL. Let's go to our application, fill out the support form, and see if we go to the thank you page. Filling out pretty much the same information as before. And submit, and it didn't work. Well, that's because we didn't tell it to do anything. What we really need to do now is add in a controller on the support page and listen for the submission event. So we're going to do that now. Let's add a controller, and we're going to do this on the UI router state of the support. And if you're familiar with controllers at all, we're going to do the dependency injection here by adding the scope and the state to the controller. And then on the state, we're going to do scope, or sorry, on the scope, we're going to do scope.on, and we have a special event called form submission. This event fires when the submission successfully occurs. So when the form submission occurs, we want to navigate to the thank you page. We have a couple of function parameters that pass in the event and the submission. You can use those if you like, you don't have to. But when the submission occurs, we're going to do state.go to the thanks page. And the thanks page matches the state name there. So let's go ahead and try this out now. We're filling out the form again with the same information. And hopefully this will go to the thank you page when we submit it. And it did. So now we have a pretty successful functioning support form. Looks good. Now there's a couple of other things we can do here. First of all, we're going to clean this up a bit by moving the support form or the support page to its own directory. So we're going to go in there and do the same thing we did with thanks.html. We're going to copy the template in to the support page, and we'll have to remove all of the quotes around it, but we'll get to that in a second. We're going to add in the template URL instead of the actual template, paste the template into the form, and I've realized we've been missing a quote in there, so we'll fix that after we create the controller. So we're going to create the controller and move the controller code into this. Now we have to wrap it with some other functionality. This does some standard JavaScript stuff and registers the support controller with the Angular module. Now, back in our UI router definition, we can now replace the controller with just the name of the controller. And if Angular gets a string, which is the name of a controller, it will look up that controller name. So now let's try that out and make sure it's all working still. The form is still loading. We add in our John Smith yet again. He really needs support apparently. And this time everything should still look good, but we've broken out the files into separate files. So that's awesome. That's all working, and that's kind of how we recommend that we do simple forms within the application. Now, one other thing that we can clean up is this URL is actually kind of hard-coded inside of this template. And it would be better if we could move this out into the config.js file. So typically what we do is we create a forms section of the config file, and we're going to add in the URL. But instead of hard-coding the project as well, we're just going to add /support to the project and grab the project URL and set it up as the app up at the top. Now we can add in multiple forms, and it's easy to change the project without breaking everything. Now inside of our controller, what we need to do is add in the form URL, but before we do that, we need to inject the app config, which was where we defined our form URL, and say appconfig.forms.support. And now that variable will be available in the scope of the template, so we can replace the URL including the single quotes with the variable form. Now inside of our application, this still works great, so we've moved our definition off to somewhere else. Now so far we're using the source attribute of the Form.IO directive being defined in the config to create the form definition or add the form definition, but there's a lot of other options we can do as well. For example, we could preload the form, and we do that using the Form.IO provider, and we pass in the source URL, like we're doing here. And what that will do is it allows me to load the form manually and then pass it to the scope. So we're going to do scope.form equals form. Now the key distinction here is now the scope.form is actually the form definition, not the form URL. And when that happens, when you have a form definition, you pass it as the form attribute instead of the source attribute. And it looks like it didn't work. And the reason for that is we forgot to define to inject the Form.IO provider into it. And once we do that, it all works. So that's cool. The next thing we need to do is we're going to load in an existing submission into this form. So we're going to go in here and just grab the submission URL. You can do this from an index as well. We'll go into that later. But for now, we're just going to comment this, the manual loading in, and add in /submission and then the ID of the submission. And by adding it into the source, it will actually load the submission as well. And we have to remember to switch the form back to source. But it says unauthorized. That's because users don't have access to that data by default. So we're going to allow anonymous to read all. We're going to add that permission in there, and that will allow them to actually read that. And now, look at that. We're loading the existing submission into the form. That's great. And we can also preload both the form and the submission instead of passing it into the source if you want to do that. So we'll copy it, we'll comment out the manual URL. We're going to have to move the, first we're going to add submission/submission ID to the URL, but we're going to have to reload this or reuse this object. So I'm going to define a variable called Form.IO and set it equal to the Form.IO definition. And, forgot a closing parentheses, and use that object to load the form. There we go. So now that'll load the form definition, but we then need to also load the submission. So we use Form.IO.load submission, which is also a promise if you've ever used promise. So we use a then submission and set the scope.submission equals to that submission. Now in our template, then we have to switch the form back to the form because it's a definition, not a URL. And we also have a submission object we can pass the submission in as. Now it'll load, and there we go. So we've preloaded the form and the submission now. There are a lot of other attributes you can pass to the Form.IO directive. For example, we can pass in hide components, which is a array of field keys. So for example, if we wanted to hide the message, we could add in message like that, and now the message is gone. We frequently see the same form embedded inside of a web page, but with slight variations, and this allows you to do things like that. We have lots more documentation available on our help site. If you go to help.form.io and then find the Angular Embedding Form.IO directive, there's lots of documentation. I hope this has been helpful in learning how to embed forms using Form.IO.